It is my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jonathan Morrow. He's an associate professor at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Morrow.
Oh, thanks. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to this. Should be fun.
Absolutely. It's my I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. I know you best as a basic science researcher, a person who's very interested in behavior, motivated behavior in particular, and how behavior in animals like rats and mice may relate to, psychiatric conditions in humans. And you have, I think, a really powerful perspective on this as a physician scientist, MD, PhD. You both do that basic science research, and you also treat patients in the clinic. And I'd just love you to speak a little bit about what it's like to kind of have your feet on both sides of the line, so to speak, to be doing both these things. Is there back and forth? Does your research inform your practice, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think so. For me, it's a challenge. It's an opportunity. I think it does. Each does inform the other. I'm not one who. I don't do research on my patients, so it's not like a direct influence like that. But as you said, I'm primarily an animal researcher. So, but I do take the neurobiological perspective with me to the clinic, and that's how I understand my patients. First and foremost, is from a neurobiological perspective. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But I do tend to look at people through that lens, and that works well for some patients. For some patients, they don't really like me treating them like a rat, but
So when you say it,
yeah.
Sorry, when you say it works well, are you talking about like you are talking to your patients about how, what's wrong with you has to do with this brain system or something like that, or do you mean something else?
Yeah, that's part of it. Is that when I'm talking to them about their addiction, I'll talk in those terms, and that makes a lot of sense to some people. To some people, it really doesn't. It's like this doesn't. They just don't think about it in terms of my brain, and this has more to do with my social circumstances or other things like that, which I don't tend to emphasize that with people. And so if that's what they're emphasizing as part of their own illness, it may not be a great fit for them. But also my treatment style would focus on some of those things. It tends to focus on those things because I do primarily medication management. And so if there's a lot of other, and there often is though, a lot of other things that contribute that you just can't address with a medication, I'm not going to be the one who's doing that. I have other people in the treatment team who are primarily focusing on those other certain, like homelessness or something. I'm not going to find somebody else, but that's not going to be my particular focus in their treatment. Yeah.
And so you sort of you're finding the right drugs that may help their symptoms, perhaps make them be able to manage their other circumstances a little bit better. Is that the kind of thing that you feel like is your main role in the clinic? Or
yeah, that's a lot of what I do, and I'll coordinate the other aspects of their care too. Like they'll need a therapist. I do a little bit of therapy, but I really don't spend a lot of my time doing that. So I'll refer them to a therapist who can use a specific modality, and I'll give them. It's really suggestions. They have to decide but ways to alter their lifestyle and things that they just how they live in order to promote sobriety as opposed to addiction. So, which I guess, that's kind of therapy, but it's really just kind of advice on what to do with your own time. Because if they're coming, that's a big difference between an addiction psychiatrist versus other people who are dealing with addiction as physicians. The patients are coming to me with a desire to stop using and get their addiction under control. So they're already invested into it to a certain degree, and so I'm helping them strategize on how to be successful with their plans, as opposed to a lot of times it's just like trying to just get people to see that maybe you should do something about this.
Yeah. And how would you say that your experience treating and managing patient care for addiction, let's say, or PTSD, I understand is another thing that you treat and also study. How would you say that those experiences have informed your animal behavioral pharmacology, psychopharmacology type research?
Well, it does in a lot of ways. When I think about it, I'm surprised at how much it influences that, because like for one thing, a big focus in my lab is comorbid disorders. It's not just addiction, and a lot of that comes from my clinical experience. With the people I see, don't just have addiction. They have multiple. The typical patient, when I'm writing up the diagnosis, they'll have like 8 different diagnoses, and it's like it's almost a case report when somebody just has one addiction, and that's the only thing I'm going to put down on that list. So there seems to be like 2 categories of people. You have people who don't have any kind of psychiatric diagnosis versus people who have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So do they really have 5 different things going wrong, like 5 different lesions, or is this really kind of a single problem or 2 problems that are being expressed in different ways? And so that's what my research is trying to find. Is I'm looking for vulnerabilities and things that are not just a vulnerability for addiction, but they'll influence PTSD, personality issues, all kinds of things that matches what I see in my patients. That's one way that it informs it. There are others as well, just kind of looking at it. So some of it is the way I design my experiments too. So because I tend to, maybe more than I would have otherwise, I do systemic administration of drugs sometimes, and looking at I'm looking at outcomes, a specific behavioral outcome, but it's just a non-specific kind of administration of a drug. I'm not targeting a particular group of cell types or a specific circuit or something like that, because I think that type of research is I do that myself. It's informative, but I know as a clinician, I'm not going to do that to my patients. So it's just not. I need something that they can just take. I have a hard enough time getting them to take Prozac, right? I'm not going to put a laser in their brain and genetically modify their stuff. That's just not going to be. That's not going to develop into a treatment anytime soon. So
right. And would you say that? So I think people that do those sorts of approaches often argue that this is where we need to go, actually, because there's specific problems that have to do with specific circuits, and bathing the whole brain in whatever is, going to have a bunch of side effects and so on, off-target effects. Do you feel like this is the kind of thing that just, I totally understand your point. We're not doing this tomorrow or anytime soon, probably in either of our careers, but, down the road, is this where this is going, in your opinion? Or do you think that, as you said, that there's some sort of like more broad underlying problem that can manifest in any, like a variety of different ways, depending on, people's experiences and so on. And that you may have some sort of underlying risk factor for disorders or something. And the particular circuits involved are not necessarily the point. It's really the underlying factor that you would want to kind of help them with. Does that make sense? Or am I, or
yeah. I think I would probably frame it a little bit differently, though, because I do think those approaches, they're probably necessary to really understand the disorder, because at least I may be wrong, but I think that these disorders, the pathophysiology is at the circuit level, or maybe even a little bit finer grain than that. So if that's where the pathology is, then we need to do those types of experiments to really understand the pathology. If you're developing a treatment, right now, anyway, our technology is just not such that we can practically do that in a person. And even if you could develop, it would be so expensive. Like, who are the people who would benefit from that treatment? There's a lot of people with addiction. They have very challenging circuit. We can't even get them insurance for. I give somebody a very efficacious treatment for opioid use disorder that will improve outcomes by 50%, and they can't get it because insurance won't pay for it, right? That's something as simple as taking a pill. So, the techniques that we're talking about, we're not going to roll that out to the people who need it. I don't think. So even if we need to target specific circuits and things like that, we need to find a simpler way of doing that. A systemically administered drug or something that can still target those pathways in the way that we want it. So like an example, I did the experiment with well, anyway, so we get ketamine, and looking at specific outcomes on behaviors as a result of ketamine, because there's research showing that ketamine strengthens prefrontal control over subcortical. So you're giving it systemically, but it's having specific effects on the circuitry that you're looking for. That's the kind of thing that you want. And it's clearly possible because, if we're talking about addiction, people are just taking cocaine systemically. They're not injecting it into a certain circuit, right? So it's developing because you gave a systemic drug. You should be able to find some kind of treatment that's also systemic, would still be efficacious. So that's the kind of thing the approach that I'm looking for. I think we need both understanding that circuitry and these more practical, just like what's a broader thing that we can target that would have the same effect as these more targeted, neuroscientific techniques. So,
right, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And my take on it is that this is part of the reason why most of our psychiatric treatments are based on these modulatory neurotransmitters, because basically they're not the ones that like cause a synapse to activate or like neuron to fire or whatever necessarily, but they're kind of modulating endogenous activity, which is then sort of limiting itself by what is active at the time and so on. And I think that's likely to be the reason why both drugs like cocaine have effects on certain types of behaviors, not others, as well as some of these treatments may have a bit of specificity that just has to do with the activity that's going on in the brain. And my other thing is that cannabinoids, which I know you study as well, are particularly in this category, in that they are sort of inherently modulatory. They're not even the endocannabinoids, they're not even there until they're recruited by activity. And giving drugs to inhibit a synapse that's not active is not going to do anything, but a synapse that is active is going to do stuff. And so to me, that's one of the interesting examples of this, potentially for therapy as well as obviously for addiction in terms of PhD and so on.
Yeah, it's just the physiology of that drug is such that it makes itself more targeted. It's because it's activity dependent, just by the nature of how it works. So you can target specific synapses, even though you're just giving this drug systemically. It makes it an attractive candidate for a treatment like that, because that's the kind of thing where you can just roll it out to a broad spectrum of patients if it works, and use that with other drugs. I don't know if we're going to get there with optogenetic manipulations. Maybe, but it's hard for me to envision that. So.
Yeah, I think that's people are becoming increasingly in that same camp, that this stuff is hard. And even if we could do it practically and get insurance to pay for it or whatever, like what are we going to do exactly? What sort of stimulation is really going to help somebody in a particular case? These are unanswered questions in many cases. So even if it's technically feasible, maybe we wouldn't kind of know what to do anyway to help somebody with the sorts of approaches. And just out of curiosity, since we were talking about cannabinoids, is this something that that you use in your clinic in your patients? Something you recommend to them, I guess. Michigan being a medical marijuana state, what's your take on that? Do you have an opinion?
Oh yeah, so I think there's a future for that once we figure it out, so some kind of cannabinoid based treatment. But the fact that it was legal for medical purposes, I think it was really a disservice to people. If in my opinion, if you want to legalize cannabis for recreational use, fine, legalize cannabis for recreation. But don't pretend it's a medication that we know. I mean, these and the indicate that's the only drug where it's used for medical purposes, sort of. But that was approved by panels of non-experts. Some were like, cannabis providers, and like, what do we know what the indications of this are? It's not based on, the research. You don't have dose recommendations. You don't have, none of that is there for this. So it is efficacious for certain things. Most of them, though, we have other drugs that work better, like pain control. Ibuprofen works better. It's not that cannabis doesn't work, but there's other things with less side effects that do work. So I don't find it useful clinically, but I don't discount that it can be useful given the proper amount of research and controlled studies and things, where we make sure that we're not just doing damage to people because we don't understand what we're prescribing to them.
Right. And part of this, it seems to me, is that, even if in fact, in a scientific study, ibuprofen is more efficacious for pain than cannabis, you may find that a patient prefers cannabis because maybe they also
Absolutely.
like getting high, And is that
Absolutely.
okay? Is that is acceptable for medical treatment? That's a tough question, I think, to me.
I don't have a problem with somebody, but I would with somebody doing that, but I want to understand what the consequences of that are in a rigorous way before I'm recommending it to somebody. Because just like the alcohol is actually very efficacious for pain control. But I'm not prescribing alcohol to people, right? Because it has, we don't, but it has a lot of other consequences that we know about. And cannabis, it actually doesn't probably have as many consequences as alcohol, but it has some serious consequences for people. For example, it increases, it looks like from the research, increases your odds of schizophrenia by about 40%. And I don't think that was considered at all when people wrote out these, and a lot of physicians aren't even aware of that. So we need to understand that more before we just recommend that as a physician to people. So I think if we were going through an FDA process, just like some company developed cannabis, it wouldn't make it because there's too many problems. There's too many side effects with it.
Right. Not to mention, I think you sort of did mention that what exactly is cannabis? It's a plant that has a bunch of chemicals in it, and THC is the main one, but the dose is unpredictable. There's various varieties of THC, and everything is metabolized to active and inactive compounds, and stuff is really complicated. And this is the downside of having like sort of a purely botanical measure. It's really hard to control, or intervention. It's really hard to control things like dose and stuff like that.
Yeah, and we have THC on formula. It's not in a kind of pure THC. It's not in high doses or anything, but it's not prescribed very much, simply because it doesn't work very well for the things that we were prescribed it for. So some things it does, like there's specific seizure disorders and things that really that's the main treatment that's going to work for it. But there's not many things like that where cannabis is really the best treatment for it, or THC is really the best treatment for it. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so another question I wanted to ask you is, as you've been describing, kind of the premise of some of your work is that we can study animals and how their brains work, and that will tell us something about how the brains of people that have problems they would like you to help them fix work, and maybe you can then use that information to do something about their symptoms and so on. What do you think about the ability of our animal models to capture either core features of human psychiatric disorders, or even, to say it perhaps a little bit more controversially or something, can animals have psychiatric disorders?
Yeah, so this is, I feel like the popular opinion among scientists has become that no animals can't have psychiatric disorder. I don't understand that. point of view, really, where that came from. I definitely think that our animal models can capture certain aspects of it. I think that's relatively uncontroversial. It's going to be controversial with a particular model. Is it capturing these features, and which ones is it capturing, and how well is it doing? That's always going to be controversial. But
do you just sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but do you mean something like, for example, in the sign and goal tracking paradigm that you use,
Yeah.
individual differences in certain types of cue responses may play some role in, let's say, addiction in some individuals, perhaps? Is that kind of what you mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the sign and goal tracker model can capture, at least we would argue, it's capturing a propensity to attribute incentive salience, so a very specific psychological process, attribute motivational salience, really, to a cue that's associated with some reward or aversive thing. So it can capture that process. You can argue about whether that's true or not. I would say that it is. And then you can also argue whether that process is involved in addiction. I don't think you can argue that sign tracking is addiction. I mean, it doesn't even involve addictive drugs most of the time when we when we use it. So no, it's not addiction. but studying that can inform you about addiction, because the processes that it's captured are also involved in addiction. And I think similar things happen with most of the animal models that we use. They're not really claiming to be the disorder itself. It's capturing an aspect of the disorder. But there also has been questioning of how useful these could possibly be if animals can't get the psychiatric disorder. Like this, maybe this process just can't happen in an animal fundamentally. The thing that I've heard most of is just depression. Like, you can't have a depressed mouse. I don't understand why we would say that, because we know a lot about animal brains and their behaviors, that like they have a lot of the same processes that we do. They have cognitive processes, they have attentional processes, they have decision making, motivational systems, emotional processes that happen in animals. So why wouldn't that go wrong with them? Why would they be immune to psychiatric illnesses? I mean, if that's the case, I want to know why. Like, I think that needs an explanation. And it's an important explanation. Why are they immune? Maybe we should know that. It's like sharks not getting cancer. We should know why.
That's a great point. Yeah, I guess part of it is how do you know if a mouse is depressed? And in a sense, like, the other thing is like, and people argue there's ways to measure that sort of thing, or related concepts, whatever. But I guess another part of it is sort of has to do with just how we define psychiatric disorders, right? Because like a key principle of anybody that comes in to see you is that they have something that is harming their life and they would like it to change. And is that the case with a mouse? Are they sort of introspecting in that way that is, I guess, in our Western civilization, at least in DSM sort of framework, is kind of fundamental to whether this is a disorder or just a personality trait or something? What's your take on that?
Well, so we define it that way because we don't know how to define it in a neurobiological way. I think we are, as most science, not all, I guess, but most scientists we're assuming that there is a pathophysiological process in the brain, and maybe, with contributions probably outside the brain as well, but that is producing this pathology, this whatever's going wrong in this person's life and leading to that introspection and whatnot. It's really a biological process that's happening there, that's responsible for that. That's the premise of almost all of our research, really. So the fact that a mouse doesn't have that kind of perspective on its life, that doesn't mean it doesn't have the same biological process going on. It doesn't have that perspective because of the mouse, so that biological process is just going to be expressed differently in a mouse. You can make the same argument for cancer models. Like cancer has profound, like psychological influences on a person, and they have an introspective reaction to that that a mouse is not going to have. But the mouse has cancer. I mean, it does. It's just it's going to be expressed in a different way because that's a mouse. So I don't think we know hardly at all how to recognize these illnesses in animals. I don't think the animal models that we use are really producing that illness for the most part in these animals. And you know, the way we go about it, I don't think they have a chance of doing that. Like what manipulate? Like if you had humans, what manipulation would you do that's going to produce depression in 100% of your people? I don't know, but that's what we expect in our animal models, right? I think in PTSD animal models, some of them are getting away from that. But a lot of them, it's still just like we do this and we expect 100% of the time that's going to produce the illness or these aspects of it. For natural psychiatric disorders in animals, that's probably not how it works. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, part of the thing here too, probably, it seems to me, is that, you know, maybe there is no such thing as depression as defined by DSM, meaning it's because really it's a cluster of a bunch of symptoms with two main factors, I think, in the case of depression, and certainly an addiction as well. Like, you know, addiction to an opioid drug may well be different than addiction to a stimulant drug, or even two individuals addicted to the same drug could be sort of for different reasons. In which case, it doesn't make a lot of sense to just knock something in and you're going to get addiction or depression or something, because there's heterogeneity there. Maybe we're just sort of cutting nature at the wrong joints or not at the joints or something, it seems to me.
Yeah, but as I say, I think the premise of our research is that there is some biological process or processes underlying this disorder, and maybe it's multiple disorders. But what you're saying there is that you have multiple biological processes to track down, and you know, for the most part, you can find that in an animal model. I'm not sure what you're going to propose that you can't, as a mechanism, that can't happen in a mouse brain. There are some things that can't, but you know, if it really has to come from ennui and an introspective, that we should be investing a lot more in psychodynamic research, because that's the level where it's going to be. Why are you studying like toll-like receptors? They don't have ennui. Like how is that going to, you know? So I feel like some of like, we don't really believe, like if you really examine it, we don't really believe that animals don't have these disorders, but for some reason we don't want to say that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of tension that I definitely feel as well as a basic scientist who's trying to do stuff that's relevant to humans. Yeah, what do we? these are big questions that come up a lot, I think. And if you were to sort of pick one thing that we could do as a field, or perhaps that you intend to do down the road, that you feel like will really improve our ability to bring new treatments to the clinic. You know, if you're giving advice to a young researcher, for example, who's doing animal research, and they really want to help the world, why should they go to a PhD program instead of a MD, or maybe an MD PhD instead of a you know, MD alone?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, I guess, well, one thing would be to just try to have that perspective of where this treatment is going to, how this research is going to develop into a treatment that you could roll out. I feel like there's not a lot of, well, there's too few basic researchers that are thinking in terms of a treatment, like how this could actually be rolled out. In addition to how do we understand the biological mechanisms of this disorder. We need both of those to happen at the same time. So I guess, you know, you said one thing, so, so
yeah, no,
I guess I could give you that one. I do wish that, I mean, pertaining to what we said, I do wish also that we had a better understanding of psychiatric illness in animals. I feel like that's really missing, and it could bring a lot to the field, especially like in terms of like PTSD or something. You go into a shelter, those animals are not acting normally. They clearly have psychiatric problems, but we don't understand that at all. And think of all the antidepressants that are prescribed to people's pets. We're using this stuff to treat psychiatric illness in animals all the time. It must have some kind of efficacy there. But we don't know how to capture those syndromes in it. We don't know what that looks like, really. We don't have a DSM for dogs or rats or whatever. We could develop that, but we don't have it. And I think it actually might be useful to do it.
That's a really intriguing idea. Any listeners out there who would like to develop the dog DSM, there could be an opportunity for you, I think. But yeah, yeah, Dr. Morrow, I could continue asking you questions all day. I really enjoy our conversation. But we should cut it off here, and so then I'll thank you for your time and for this really interesting conversation. And again, I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. This was great.
Bye.
All right, bye.